In the first video I ever posted to my channel, I talked about how Splash Mountain can feel like a complete experience because of its use of a classical 3-act structure. I make that sort of comparison a lot, connecting how creators tell a story for a movie, novel, or video game to how a story is told for a ride. I think doing that is a pretty useful tool, but it's also limited. Those other mediums I mentioned can all tell a similar style of traditional narrative. They can explore so much more plot, characters, and theme than is really possible in the constraints of a theme park ride. So rather than going the route of Splash Mountain and trying to adapt a traditional narrative to this limited format, some rides, actually most of them, eschew that paradigm completely. And these non-narrative attractions garner many of the traditional storytelling elements, and in their place we can really focus on the other aspects, like world building, atmosphere, and maybe most importantly, pacing. But even without a strict storyline or set of characters to follow, non-narrative attractions shouldn't just be a collection of incoherently connected moments. All rides, narrative or not, should sweep the rider up on a journey, and doing so requires structure, and pacing that derives from that structure. Phantasialand gets this concept. While this German park is so geographically small that it's almost hidden inside the Cologne suburb of Brühl, it takes that limitation to heart and builds so much dense detail into each attraction that you'll forget they're practically built on top of each other. The park has so many special experiences, but maybe none as special as their Intamin Blitz coaster, Taron. It's not even close to the tallest, fastest, or longest coaster I've been on, and yet when I hopped off my first ride, I had no hesitation in calling it the best coaster I'd ever ridden. My name is Greg Gerberick, and this is the Q-Line Lectures, a series about theme park design. Roller coasters have an inherent challenge to overcome when talking about pacing. In a basic 3-act structure, the tension and stakes gradually increase until reaching an exciting climax late in the story, after which the intensity winds down towards the resolution. This isn't some arbitrary formula that must always be followed, but it's a proven model for crafting a complete and satisfying experience. Most rides do strive to achieve some form of this structure by building up to a finale. But for many roller coasters, this simply isn't possible for a pretty fundamental reason. Being gravity-powered, coasters are constrained by the relationship between height and speed. Let me pause for a second to give you a chance to turn the video off, unsubscribe from my channel, and maybe go do something you enjoy. Because the time has come to talk about everyone's favorite subject, physics. Because when I talk about a coaster's relationship to height and speed, what I'm really talking about is potential and kinetic energy. Potential energy is energy stored in an object based on its relative position. It's defined by the formula U equals FGH, where FG can be broken into M times gravitational constant G, which is 9.8. Actually, sorry, no math. Let's just say this. The higher something is, the more potential energy it has. Kinetic energy, on the other hand, is directly related to an object's velocity. So as a car on test track whips around a bank curve, it can be said to have tons of kinetic energy. On a standard roller coaster, we begin by being pulled up the lift hill to the ride's highest point. This is where our potential energy is at its highest, because we have so much height to play with. It's also where our kinetic energy is basically at its lowest, because the train is barely moving at all. As we plummet down the big drop, we're getting closer to the ground, so our potential energy is decreasing. That energy isn't going away, it's being converted to kinetic energy, thus the coaster train is moving faster. The train begins to crest up a camelback hill, and that kinetic energy begins to be converted back into potential energy as the train slows down, but gets higher off the ground. In a perfect world, this dance between kinetic and potential energy would continue infinitely, but as you may have realized, our world is far from perfect. Converting potential to kinetic energy isn't free, and some energy is lost to frictional forces, from the wheels rolling on the track or air resistance. With the frictional forces ever increasing, the net sum of our kinetic and potential energy is always decreasing. To put that another way, after the initial big drop, a coaster has basically no choice but to get increasingly slower and closer to the ground. This is the inherent challenge that coasters face with pacing and non-narrative storytelling. How can a coaster feel climactic when its biggest and baddest moment must always come first? How can it build to a satisfying conclusion when physics demand the ride end with the trains at its lowest and slowest? Coaster designers try their hardest to overcome the lack of energy using forceful maneuvers, like inversions and helices, but often this just isn't enough. Of course, there are exceptions to this, especially among coasters that use hilly terrain to their advantage to gain potential energy, but by and large, this gravitational limitation explains why many coasters have spectacular beginnings and lackluster endings. Pulling off an exciting finale just requires too much energy. So now we begin to see the connection back to pacing in the 3-act structure. If an exciting moment on a roller coaster requires either height or speed, graphing the sum of the kinetic and potential energy shows us a very abstracted graph of the dramatic stakes the rider feels while on a coaster. Take for example the classic hypercoaster Raging Bull at Six Flags Great America. The sum energy total of the coaster car rises as it's pulled to the top of the hill by the lift chain. We reach our dramatic peak at the coaster's highest point, and as we begin to fall over that peak, the ride hits its climax. From there, it's a series of hills and valleys that, while enjoyable, constantly lose energy to friction until the ride peters out to its conclusion. Despite it being a really fun ride, the graph can reveal why it, and basically every coaster that follows the classic big first drop, struggle at that non-narrative storytelling. What we see here in this graph is actually the complete mirror image of the basic 3-act structure I used way back when discussing Splash Mountain. It seems a sad truth that gravity and storytelling just don't mix. So how do we break that dynamic? Enter the launch coaster. And with these new technologies comes a completely different approach to coaster design. Launch technology allows you to gain speed without sacrificing height. It basically severs the previous dynamic between kinetic and potential energy. Early launch coasters, like the very first, Montezuma's Revenge at Knott's Berry Farm, typically use this feature as more of a one-off gimmick that centers the whole ride around a massive acceleration, before quickly finding its way back to the station. This trend of making the launch into the focal point of the experience stuck around and was expanded into coasters like Top Thrill Dragster at Cedar Point, King to Ka at Six Flags Great Adventure, and Accelerator, again at Knott's. Other launch coasters grew to have more involved layouts, but still, the launch was the first element, and basically just a replacement for the first big drop. For this, think of coasters like the Incredible Hulk at Islands of Adventure, Storm Runner at Hershey Park, or Rockin' Roller Coaster at Hollywood Studios. Even with longer layouts, these launch coasters still fall prey to the same basic energetic pacing as their lift hill forefathers. In recent years, as the cost and complexity of launch systems have gone down, designers have begun to see the potential of launch technology to unlock new ways of pacing a coaster experience. If you can easily gain speed on a flat surface, you could build coasters in ways that were never before thought possible. Now you have complete design control over how fast you're going at any given moment, and that drastically changes what sorts of layouts are possible. These multi-launch coasters, like Maverick at Cedar Point, Cheetah Hunt at Busch Gardens Tampa, and Copperhead Strike at Carowinds, are quietly revolutionary in redefining what a coaster is capable of. This technology has even allowed for the introduction of narrative-focused coasters, like Verbolten at Busch Gardens Williamsburg, Hagrid's Magical Creature Motorbike Adventure at Islands of Adventure, and eventually Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind at Epcot. But you don't need to have an out-and-out narrative to make a compelling coaster experience. And never was that more clear to me than when I rode Taron at Phantasialand. Walking into the park, I was incredibly excited to ride Taron. But even with that anticipation, I wasn't prepared for the sheer scale and density of the Klugheim area of the park. This whole section, themed as a mystical Norse village, was crafted around Taron, and even includes a family coaster called Rake. The complex layout of the area is full of winding paths and viewpoints that provide tons of dramatic angles to watch Taron as the coaster, looking like some kind of rampaging beast, roars around the track. Despite how close you can get to the coaster, its structure is so intertwined with the village itself that it's difficult to even get a sense of the layout of the ride, with seemingly infinite jet black steel swooping off in every direction and crossing over itself over 100 times. This multi-layered design really begs you to explore the whole village to find what new details and secrets lie behind the next covered bridge, rocky cavern, or cobblestone market. The fact that this whole area feels so expansive, yet is less than 1/7 the size of Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland, is testament to how thoughtful Phantasialand is with using every available inch. The queue for Taron weaves you through a series of wooden huts at the center of the village, often with the ride track and supports just feet away from you. Being a non-narrative experience, the queue doesn't contain any real story to speak of, but just being this close to the textured craftsmanship only brings you further into this fully realized Norse fantasy. Eventually you reach the station, pull down your excellent restraints that offer a ton of freedom, and prepare to begin your journey. The start of the coaster slowly takes you past a waterfall that we'll be seeing again later in the ride. It's a nice tease of what's to come, and a helpful geographic landmark for riders to better understand their path. The train pulls into an area where you're boxed in by tight walls on either side and a tunnel above you. These close confines only add to the sense of speed you're about to get. The score swells and then grows quiet in anticipation as we explode out onto what can only be described as the spaghetti bowl of track in front of us. Contrasting with the tight launch area, it feels amazing to soar up towards the sky banking off the rock wall. First-time riders will certainly expect this to be the highest and fastest point of the ride, but that isn't the case here. Right after this, the intensity of the ride really begins to show, as the first airtime hill tries to rip you clean out of your seat before diving into a stone cellar beneath the building. From that small space, we burst out into an overbanked turn along the other rock wall before flying through a roof. Taron is constantly pushing you between tight spaces and open expanses, and that contrast really heightens the sensation of both extremes. After the roof, the ride really changes gears and starts to feel like it's running out of steam. The elements are noticeably tamer and almost remind me of those final turns on Raging Bull. As the train dips into a trench below the ground, it feels as though the ride might be ending, but rather than hit the brakes, it hits a second launch and is instantly shot to the ride's highest point. The close walls of the trench make the acceleration feel even more powerful and contrast perfectly to flying up past the waterfall from the very start of the ride. If you're as lucky as I was, you'll even get a nice splash of water in the face at 73 miles per hour. Up in these heights, riders are treated to a grand vista of the whole Klugheim area. It's the first time there's been a good vantage point to take everything in. From this perspective, the whole area looks remarkably different. This is a real wow moment, but it also lasts all of 0.2 seconds before you're back diving towards the ground with wild twists. The next series of elements are similar to those found on the first half of the ride. Careening through the rocks, diving through the basement of a building, past the waterfall, and eventually soaring through the rooftops of the village. While those are all the same beats from the first half, this second half is paced even more aggressively, with larger elevation changes and faster, whippier transitions between elements. We're tracing a similar path, but on a grander scale, not repeating what came before, but an escalation, in every sense of the word. The ride closes out with a few airtime hills that offer a final opportunity to take in some of that insane mess of track we've just traversed, before pulling back into the station with tons of speed to spare. Now that we've seen what Taron has to offer, let's see how it works from the energetic framework we used earlier, graphing the sum of kinetic and potential energy over time. It starts off not at zero, but with some amount of potential energy, because the station is actually above the second launch trench. There's a big jump in energy as it accelerates forwards and upwards, gaining both kinetic and potential energy. From there, it's a steady course of losing energy to friction forces as the train hauls its way through the first half of the ride. Approaching the second launch trench, the train is at its lowest energetic point, having lost most of its kinetic energy and all of its potential energy. With the huge second launch, it immediately jumps from its lowest energetic state all the way to its highest. After that peak, it again gradually loses energy to friction until pulling into the final brakes, with both kinetic and potential energy still left over. While Taron's energetic graph doesn't line up perfectly with the basic 3-act structure I used for Splash Mountain, comparing the two reveals much of what makes the coaster so successful. In a basic 3-act structure, we're building up to that climax that comes late in the experience. By relying on gravity alone, a coaster like Raging Bull is forced to put that climax as basically the first element. But Taron is free to delay it till it'll have the most impact, around the 2/3 mark like we see with the basic 3-act structure. Not only does this make for a more dynamic and surprising experience, but it allows for the coaster to have a true climactic moment. It gives Taron a propulsive shape and journey that feels like it's always growing, rather than just whimpering towards a conclusion. Going a step further, many stories that follow the classic hero's journey, like I've discussed in other episodes, feature a beat where the main character's inevitable victory is preceded by their worst moment, more pretentiously known as the Dark Night of the Soul. It isn't enough for the climax of Splash Mountain to have Brer Rabbit escape to freedom, but audiences want to see him escape, just moments after almost being eaten alive. There's something really impactful about a climax quickly taking a character from their lowest point to their highest, and that's the experience Taron successfully translates, using pacing and structure alone. It's not something any writer would ever consciously think about, but it's absolutely felt, and that's what non-narrative storytelling is all about. When Phantasialand first started building Taron, rumors swirled that it might feature dark ride scenes, or animatronics, or a fancy drop track, or maybe even just some inversions. But it turns out it doesn't need any of those tricks to craft a fulfilling experience. What a ride makes you feel doesn't have to be dictated by a complicated story or characters. Sometimes it's as elemental as the forces of gravity and friction. When my first ride on Taron finished, the German stranger sitting next to me looked over, let out some German swears, and gave me a huge high five. I didn't have to understand a single word of German to understand exactly what he was saying. Taron is one hell of a ride. Thanks for watching.